This video is going to be about the colonization that is going to be taking place in the North American continent, really the early colonization. So it's going to be dealing with your Spanish colonization, your English colonization, and a bit from France and the Dutch as well in particular. This is a really great map that I have found that I want to use to illustrate kind of where we are going to be going with these talks. This is going to be a whole kind of two-part video on colonization. In the first video, it's going to be kind of this early colonization, and then ultimately we're going to be talking about the British colonization and the 13 original colonies and the different regions there, and ultimately how we get to the stage leading up to the American Revolution. So this map here kind of shows that end product of what the New World is going to look like more or less on the eve of the American Revolution. So this is where we are heading. So now how did we get there? So the first really important thing that we kind of need to talk about in this is that the Spanish, as you remember, they were the first ones here, and they really got the ball rolling with the colonization efforts, in particular in the Caribbean and in South America and in Mexico. And if you remember, they really cut off the development of these Native American groups and these civilizations, in place of the Aztec and Incan and even Mayan cultures. The Spanish are going to be coming in and basically imposing themselves into these areas, and in doing so, in some cases, they're actually going to be building some kind of European style cities, and you're going to see kind of a picture of that, or not a picture, but a painting of that momentarily. But one thing that's really important to understand is that Spain needed to kind of control these territories still, and they needed to be able to fend off different actions from different Native Americans, but also the other nations now that are going to be kind of moving into North America after the Spanish. So in doing so, they had to build forts kind of all along their northern perimeter, partly as again, blocked from Native Americans, but protection from these other nations as well. In doing so, they're also creating these missionaries, which is basically a group of religious, in this case, Christian and Catholic groups that are basically trying to convert the native people, trying to kind of make them docile and not necessarily likely to attack them, and kind of adapt and to this Spanish way of life. So how else do the Spanish kind of influence this area? So for starters, you get a blending of this culture, right? You have this mixing of this Spanish culture and this native culture, and in doing so, you get what's known as these mestizo people, and that is kind of half-blood, half native, half Spanish, and these people are really just looking to have a good life, and these people are typically building these farming communities that are typically in the northern Mexico and southwestern United States, and they're expanding into these areas just looking to have a living for themselves. Most of these Spanish men that were coming over, they obviously wanted to have wives in most cases, and there were no real Spanish women in the New World, so the Native American women were the next best thing here, and that's how you get this kind of blending of culture when it really comes down to it. So this little painting up here, can I expand? I can't apparently get close to it. There we go. This painting up here kind of shows that European style building, if you will. You got these arches and kind of this this roofing up here. You have this kind of church looks like in the background. I know it's kind of blurry, the resolution isn't that great, but it's kind of trying to show these type of these cities or communities really that were being created for this in this blending. So you can't really also forget that Spain, this overseas empire that Spain had created, and dealing with these Native American groups really is what's going to kind of make them the most powerful nation in Europe, definitely. You have all of these riches kind of pouring in, the gold among other things as well, of course, other resources that are coming in, and in this case, you are basically, Spain is going to exert that influence and try to exert that influence in Europe as well. This is perhaps a more precise map of what we're talking about here, of the Spanish borderlands in the southern United States in particular, and ultimately, in northern Mexico. This map just, is kind of showing you, the extent of this Spanish range here in North America. So we obviously know that the large big colonies in the Americas at least came from England, at least leading into the American Revolution. So how do we get from Spain being so dominant in North America ultimately to England being the dominating factor here? So I need to kind of give a little bit of a backstory just to kind of lead into this. In the late 1400s, you have a change of dynasty in England. So this change of ruling family, if you will. And you have this man named Henry VII ultimately take control of the throne. He is succeeded by Henry VIII, who is most importantly known for kind of leading these Reformation, stepping away from the Catholic Church in England, mostly because he just wanted to be able to divorce his wives because he was not being given a son. A son wasn't being born, and he just kept divorcing his wives and trying in hopes that he would ultimately get a son. So you have a bit of squabble kind of over the succession here, but ultimately you have Queen Elizabeth kind of come to the throne, a little bit later, and she is going to be kind of the one that's going to be the most important for this story, if you will. She is also Protestant, and she's ensuring this Protestant push of England over the Catholic Church, and this isn't going to make the Pope particularly happy. But Queen Elizabeth, just to give her a little backstory, she is obviously a well-educated. She's a noble birth. She was the daughter of the king, I believe, to his second wife. When she comes into power, actually, she's obviously going to be courted by a number of people trying to marry her, and she doesn't marry herself, but you could say because she felt it was going to weaken England, right? If she's going to be marrying, typically queens and kings marry other nobles, right? So if she were to marry a higher figure in one of these other European countries, she was worried that they would then come in and try to take the power of England from her, and she wouldn't have as much of a say. So that's arguably one of the reasons why she never married. Also, she's going to have a bit of a naval power expansion, throughout her reign. It wasn't so much her that was making it happen, but it was something that's going to kind of play into this story here in a second. So during Elizabeth's rule, you kind of have a pseudo-undeclared war, if you will, between Spain and England, and that's going to kind of more or less culminate in what is known as the attack, or it's attacked by the Spanish Armada. And to give this a little bit of a backstory, the King Philip of Spain actually had been married to Queen Elizabeth's sister, who was actually queen before she was. So what happened is they never produced an heir, so that's why Elizabeth was able to come to the throne. And when ultimately Mary died, King Philip's right to rule ultimately died with her. So the fact that there was no heir, it then went to Elizabeth, and King Philip wasn't necessarily too thrilled about this. And top that off, you also had some Spanish looting that was going on of these ships with their kind of newly expanded navy, kind of pirateering, and also some kind of incursions by the English into the Spanish Netherlands as well. So all of those things kind of made Spain not particularly happy with England, and it culminates in this armada being sent to England, ultimately to invade and basically take over. And this was ultimately backed by the Pope, because again, England had been stepping away from Catholicism. They were still Christian, but they had kind of stepped away and were forming their own church, which didn't make the Pope happy. So he kind of backed this armada and this attack into England, right? So you have this kind of, also this man named Sir Francis Drake in this year. He actually burns a large portion of the Spanish fleet at a town named Calais, and ultimately they then attack into England, or they try to attack into England. So with the door kind of opened now for the British, you get the first major attempts by them to create a colonizing effort into the New World. So the first big one is known as this lost colony of Roanoke, which is technically in North Carolina today. It was Sir Walter Raleigh, this man, was granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth to do this, and he sets up this expedition. You have some kind of exploration efforts and some settlers ahead of this major push, and this colonizing expedition, shows up in this area looking for these people, but they're unable to kind of find them. So what do? They end up dropping about 115 people to kind of colonize in this particular area. They run into some issues with just the people around them, but also just they're not able to farm, and they're not, the supplies are running low. So ultimately, this man named John White, he returns to England, trying to get help and to bring supplies. So White gets delayed quite a bit, partially as a result of the war that's been going on between Spain and England, and also just the bad weather and it being winter in particular. But he gets delayed, a number of years here, and really it takes him 3 years to kind of return to the area. So when he gets there, what he finds is the colonists are gone. And in fact, the only evidence of the colonists at all is this word Croatoan that's kind of been carved into one of the fence posts, which you can kind of see, this drawing down here representing that. And the question becomes, what happened to these people? And it's one of the biggest mysteries, in American history, probably. What happened? So there's some theories. The first big theory is ultimately that the Native American people, they were the ones that kind of came in and killed these people. There was a massacre. In fact, it's written later by John Smith, I believe, that Chief Powhatan, which is going to be the guy they're going to be dealing with in Jamestown, he actually takes responsibility and says that he was the one that organized this and set up this massacre of these colonists. Other people believe that because of the word Croatoan written on this fence post, you have kind of this integration into the local Croatoan, Indians, Native Americans that were nearby on one of these islands in off the coast of North Carolina. So I wanted to show you a map here of these two colonies, Roanoke first, and then ultimately where Jamestown's going to be when we get talking about that in a second. They're pretty close to one another. So that claim that Powhatan, might have killed these people, it's probably not necessarily true, but that's what he said, and you got to take that for what it is, with not too many accounts being able to verify or not. But this is where Roanoke was. You have the barrier islands off of North Carolina here now. And this is where ultimately Jamestown is going to end up, in these kind of tidewater areas of Virginia, which are going to become really, really important for the mid-Atlantic colonization, and southern kind of colonization moving forward as well for the British. But we will get into that. So Jamestown, what is Jamestown? Jamestown is ultimately a colony that had received a charter from King James, in this case, who ultimately came after Queen Elizabeth, and he gives this charter to what is known as the Virginia Company of London. And the idea is that these people are going to be brought to the New World. I actually believe they take 3 ships under this man named Christopher Newport, who is going to kind of bring them to the New World and ultimately, kind of establish this colony. And this Jamestown is where they kind of pick, where I showed you on that map before. Ultimately, you're going to have some squabbles over control of Jamestown a bit, and you have some issues with the people as well. But other kind of problems that they run into, which it's just a bad site, right? They were supposed to pick a pretty good site for this, and they don't pick the best. In particular, they kind of land in a swampy area, and that swampy area, you run into issues with the diseases that are kind of carried by the insects, in particular the mosquitoes, but also just the water was not good. It's something called brackish, and it's basically water that, it's got a salt content to it. So between the bad water and the possible diseases and things, from this swampy area, that's going to have a really major implications for these settlers in their initial time here. So they're also surrounded by Native American groups in particular, led by this man named ultimately going to be called Chief Powhatan. And you're going to kind of get some hostile relationships between them too, and because of how they handle one another. But perhaps one of the biggest issue is that when they first get there, they're there to make money. All these people that signed on for this are part of this company. They're looking to make a profit here, and they want to make money. So they think they're going to be in and out pretty quickly, and they don't intend to stay for a super long period of time. At least most of these settlers anyway. So when they get there, they are looking for gold in particular. So they didn't put the time in to kind of plant crops and such, and it's said that they actually found this whole lot of pyrite, which is what fool's gold. So they were kind of picking up all this, and they were, oh man, we're striking it big here, but they didn't put the time in to kind of think long term, and that's going to be a big problem for them, because a lot of them are going to die in this. You're going to have a number of them ultimately dying as a result of the bad water and those other issues that we were talking about. This is a painting of the type of settlement that you could expect at the time, and it says it's Jamestown. You have this palisade wall built by by these logs and these fence posts that they create, and the settlement kind of in the actual fort itself. Yep. So the year goes by, I guess the winter goes by, and they're running into issues. So if it wasn't for the leadership of this Captain John Smith, it's possible that this colony might not have actually made it. And one thing that John Smith is known for in particular is he is a bit of a hard case. He establishes rules in the colony that people must work if they wanted to be able to eat, right? Additionally, they were going to be kind of looking to trade for food with the Powhatan Indians, and they're so desperate at this point because of the hardships that they've faced, that he's willing to trade them their resources, their guns and ammunition and things like that for whatever food they can get, because that's how tough of a times they've had. Ultimately, you have the relations kind of sour with both these groups. So you have some raids that are going on in Jamestown, and you kind of in both directions really. And John Smith is allegedly he's captured by these Native Americans, and what happens is, at least according to John Smith, you have Pocahontas allegedly saving Smith's life at the hand of his people when he's about to be killed. Smith says anyway that she basically jumps in front of him and puts her body on top of his, and ultimately saves his life. Her father, Chief Powhatan, ultimately takes pity on him at that point and kind of sends him back to Jamestown. This is believed to be a bit fictionalized at this point, because it's written about 10 years after the fact, when Pocahontas now has kind of come back to England. He's kind of, they say, trying to kind of elevate her status a little bit, but also she supposedly also saved his life from a plot, basically by these disgruntled settlers who were being, forced to work by John Smith, and because of how much of a hard case he is, they apparently were going to try to take his life. Pocahontas learns about this. It's a mix of settlers and natives that are probably planning to do this, so she tells him about it and kind of saves his life too. But you have other issues in Jamestown too. This starvation kind of is prevalent, for most of their first couple of years in this area, and you get what's known as the starving time. So you have this lack of food and starvation, and it's really important to understand that this colony, in these people's mind, was never really meant to actually grow its own food. In most cases, they were just expected to trade with the Indians, and they were also expected to get kind of a consistent resupply efforts from England, but those resupplies kind of come slower than necessary. Some of them get stalled. They add more people that need to be fed too, and this time period between 1609 and 1610, you have a lot of people die. Only about 60 of the 214 people actually survive the winter, and in these cases are they're eating more or less whatever they could. You have stories of them eating, leather. You have boiling and eating the leather. You have eating rats, dogs and cats if they can get a hold of them. Kind of anything they could to survive here. And in fact, you even have an instance of cannibalism where one of the settlers actually, kills and eats his wife, and as a result, he obviously is executed, but that's just the type of problems these guys are going through at the time, and it's really not a fun place. Ultimately, to be. Jamestown survives this really harsh time period, this winter, known as the starving time. They survive the not having the food. They survive this kind of Indian Native American siege on them, and later that spring, you have a kind of new arrival of people to the colony, and this is going to really change this colony forever. In particular, you have this man named John Rolfe who comes over, and he actually is in possession of some tobacco seeds. The tobacco that had been native to North America was kind of not the greatest tobacco as far as the English felt, and the tobacco seeds that Rolfe had access to were a much sweeter tobacco, and just fortunately for them, tobacco thrives in this type of climate, and tobacco really then flourished, and this is going to be brought back to England and used as this major cash crop, and it's going to kind of ensure the economic stability of this colony going forward, and you have ultimately Virginia expanding now as a result. You're going to get a lot more settlements kind of cropping up all around the area. So this fighting kind of was still going on and existing between the Powhatan Confederacy and these Virginia settlers now. And you still had these skirmishes going on between the two. And in one instance, the Jamestown settlers actually were able to convince another one of the group of natives around there that weren't necessarily super loyal to the Powhatans to kind of come up with this scheme to kidnap Pocahontas, and they do. So they kidnap her, and ultimately during her captivity, she's going to actually learn English. She's going to kind of learn the culture, and she's actually going to marry John Rolfe. And this is going to kind of establish a couple years of peace here between these groups. And you have this is a picture of Pocahontas after the fact when she has now gone back to England, and she kind of comes to be a little bit of a celebrity over there. This is her in her kind of nice with garb Virginia here, beginning to expand mostly as a result of the economic stability that's going to be provided now by the tobacco crops. Ultimately, you're going to need to establish some form of government and group that's going to be responsible for these people coming in, and ultimately that's what you get. You have this House of Burgesses created in 1619, and its role is to make these laws and kind of encourage growth now and more settlers to kind of come to this area. So a Burgess is defined really as an elected male representative of a municipality, and that's what you get. You get 22 members, that basically are holding meetings in the colony's church to kind of decide different things about the colony. And another little thing that you have here is the women in this colony. They were actually extremely outnumbered by men. And in most cases, they're outnumbered here 3 to 4 to 1. So you really feel like 3 to 4 times the amount of women than men. And that's going to be interesting because women are going to have a bit more rights as a result of that. Women are going to kind of be able to refuse marriage when they might not have been able to otherwise and such. And the last thing here that we have is dealing with Africans. You have the arrival of the first group of Africans into the New World here, or at least into the British colonies. And the story goes is that you have this Dutch ship that kind of arrives off the coast of Virginia, and with that, they show up and they're kind of hurting. I guess they'd been stuck in some sort of storm and they're really desperate for some supplies and things. And they had actually just taken a number of Africans basically out off of a Spanish vessel. So they offer to trade, and they trade these Africans for these supplies and go on their merry way. But now you have this group of about 20 African servants or people here in Virginia that begin kind of working these tobacco farms. And the role of these people is really what's kind of called into question here, because they're not necessarily slaves, and the reason why people think that is because some of these men are going to ultimately become kind of free players in Virginia after this. So the thought is maybe that they're closer to indentured servants, but either way, this is going to kind of begin this trade and this slave trade, going into the British colonies. And by the 1700s, this is going to kind of completely change. These people are going to lose the right to vote that they have. They potentially could be forced back into slavery, and it's kind of the beginning of that whole flow toward a African slave trade and African slave growth in the New World. This is actually a photograph of a replica of the meeting hall for the House of Burgesses. This would be actually later on when the House of Burgesses had moved from what was the capital in Jamestown to the new capital in Williamsburg, Virginia. But this kind of just goes to show you what type of meeting hall these people were meeting in. I just wanted to take a second to kind of define what an indentured servant is for those of you that don't know. Indentured servant is a person who had signed an agreement to serve a master for a certain number of years in essentially payment for a trip over to the Americas. So basically you would agree to be there for the time, and you'd work for them and kind of be their servant, and when that was all said and done, you'd be a free person in the New World, because it was costly to get over here initially when it first came down to it. And between 1619 and 1624, you have another major influx of people coming in. 5,000 more people or so are kind of sent to Virginia by this company. You still have some issues between the Native Americans and just it being a hard place to live in this kind of new colony before it was completely established. And the company ultimately is declared bankrupt by the king in 1624. And he annuls their charter and ultimately declares Virginia a royal colony. We are going to move north now to the founding of the Plymouth Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and I want to just kind of show you where that obviously is located. This is a map of the two right here. Just if you are aware of the geography here, this is the eastern end of Long Island. You have Montauk out over here. This is Connecticut, and you would eventually come down to New York and New Jersey over here. So this is Massachusetts, and this is where these pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Colony folks are going to now be coming in to establish sort of a religious colony. We have kind of touched upon it briefly, but if you remember, England had its own established church. Under Elizabeth, you had this kind of Anglican church, the Church of England, being established under the Tudors there, and really when it came down to it, you had different beliefs being kind of persecuted a little bit. And one of these groups, these separatists, they believed essentially that the Anglican Church wasn't reforming quick enough, and they were still kind of attached to some of these kind of Roman Catholic ideals, and ultimately they felt they wanted to, this Reformation to continue even more, and they wanted to separate from this Church of England, and as a result you had, these church officials in England kind of persecuting against these people a little bit. So by being opposed to this and trying to get away from this, they actually set sail for the Netherlands first. And in the Netherlands, they were there for 20 years or so in the early 1600s. But ultimately, you had a group of these people decided this wasn't enough, and they wanted to take a trip to the Americas. So in September in 1620, you have a group basically go on this ship called the Mayflower, and they were trying to take the difficult journey across the Atlantic to New York. They had heard that the colonies that were happening there, in New Netherlands, would be a good place for them to go to practice freely, because they figured there would be no one there to bother them. So they headed off across the Atlantic in, these pretty tough conditions to get there, and ultimately they land around Massachusetts off Cape Cod. And they were attempting to go farther south to the Hudson River, but the tides and the weather and the currents really just didn't cooperate, so they had to turn back. But when they came back, they got together on this ship and created something that's known as the Mayflower Compact. And this is really the first kind of time where you have something like this going on, where you have everyone being able to vote, really ensuring these laws for this general good of the group. And they were looking for this religious freedom, and this is what they got, right? They're kind of landing in this area where there's going to be no one really around, definitely no English people, to tell them how to worship and how to practice their religion. But when they get there, it's tough. They left in September, and when you cross the Atlantic, it takes a little while, and they're landing here now in late fall and early winter, anyone who's been up in New England and Massachusetts area in the winter knows it's the climate and such is really, really difficult and really harsh. So they're landing in a really poor time here, and you get a lot of starvation. You don't have that much food. The shelters are tough to improvise pretty quickly. You have diseases running rampant, and it just doesn't go well for them initially. But fortunately, in a very large coincidence, really, you have this group, the Wampanoag Indians. They ultimately help the Pilgrims, and it's a really interesting story and fascinating story because this man named Squanto, who had actually been taken by an English exploration ships earlier, years before, who had ended up in Europe, almost sold into slavery to some Spanish, trying to convert him to Christianity. He ended up, kind of between these wars that were going on in Europe, and he actually was able to make his way back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believe it or not, following Captain Smith, the same Captain Smith we were just talking about, John Smith, and he was there, and he was able to communicate with these people and help translate, and through his help, these people were able to learn how to plant, corn and other things, in this sandy soil that's not very hospitable to them, and ultimately throughout the course of the year, they learned from each other, and they were able to get a harvest, and the first celebration is supposedly, this harvest, the celebration celebrating this harvest and yield of the food that they're able to now. So roughly 10 years later, in 1629, you have another group of religious people known as the Puritans, who are ultimately going to receive a charter from King James to settle in the Massachusetts Bay Area, which I had just shown you on the map just before. They were, they were trying to be pushed into, conforming to the Church of England, and they didn't really want that. So they set off and they create their own religious society here in Massachusetts, founded on these religious principles. The first governor's name is John Winthrop, and they create this framework of government, again based around religion. And over the course of the next decade, so really between 1630 and 1640 or so, you're going to have roughly 20,000 more people coming to this area and ultimately settling, creating the settlements in Boston, and around Boston, at Charlestown, at Watertown, and around that area. So you do start to get some other colonies as well. That's because these Puritans, who, had left England and trying to be able to practice the religion how they wanted, they didn't necessarily believe other people should practice the religion how they wanted, especially in their colony. So you have some disagreements between these people in Massachusetts and a man named Roger Williams, so much so that in 1636 he actually gets banished from Massachusetts colony, and he leaves to kind of create Rhode Island and found Providence as kind of this more free-thinking area, if you will. And a woman named Anne Hutchinson, actually, she also has a disagreement with these preachers, and she also decided to leave Massachusetts for Rhode Island, and you kind of have the founding of Rhode Island, as this more free-thinking, less adhering to these puritanical, rules, if you will. So next, you actually, a couple of years later, you have some more Puritans looking to practice in a little bit different ways as well, and you end up with them traveling down, a little farther to Connecticut, and they create something known as the Fundamental Orders, which are basically a framework of self-government. They create a governor, you have a legislative assembly and courts, and the big thing about this is it's really stressing and ensuring the rights of individuals. So just like that, you now have Massachusetts, you have Rhode Island. We're moving now away from the British colonies, the English colonies, and you Now, we're going to now be talking about France and what becomes known as New France. So just for starters and how this kind of ends up, before we start talking about these colonies a little bit more, you have the founding of Quebec and Louisiana, and this is a number of years apart, but, initially you have Samuel Champlain who founds, Quebec initially as part of a fur trading company down the St. Lawrence River, if you remember from our explorers that we talked about. And ultimately, you just have this diffusion of the French kind of throughout this area until you get, a number of years later, Father Jacques Marquette and a man named Louis Joliet, who ultimately set off down the Mississippi River, exploring it and claiming land for France, and ultimately just learning about the area. And they learn that the Mississippi River actually dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. They don't get that far because they didn't want to go any farther and possibly run into hostile Spaniards. So they turn back, and then ultimately, a couple years later, you have a man named Robert de La Salle, and he pushes farther down the Mississippi River and claims, the mouth of the Mississippi River for France, and he names this area after King Louis, King Louis XIV, and that becomes Louisiana. So life in New France was an interesting one. When it really comes down to it, this was a low-populated area, at least of Frenchmen. The climate in the winter is really, really rough. That just kind of naturally keeps the population down. You have a population census done in 1672 that you have about 6,700. That's about double what it was 10 years before that, though, so you have this improvement there for sure. But, a lot of these people that you get settling this area are fur trappers, or you have what's known as I'm going to butcher this, but the coureurs de bois, or translated to these runners of the woods, who are these trappers and woodsmen, living in this area, interacting with the Native Americans there and kind of working together for the most part. Additionally, you had missionaries, coming into the area trying to convert the Native Americans, and, a little bit later in the timeline, you have settlements, cropping up, and the nobles kind of trying to settle these lands a little bit more. And, the relationships that these people had with the Native Americans were important for them because of that trade that was going on. And you had a major relationship between the French and the Huron Indians, the Native Americans, and they became kind of business partners and friends mostly, but you did have some enemy relationships as well with the Iroquois Confederation and the French. And in fact, the Iroquois almost wiped out the French presence here at one point. I believe this painting is meant to be, Father Marquette there and Louis Joliet, potentially at the mouth of the Mississippi River at the Gulf of Mexico, claiming this land in the name of France. It's this romantic depiction of it. And anyway. Lastly, this is a map from about 1700, kind of showing the French territory. It's in French here, but you can see the French territory here. Looks like this is probably meant to be Spain, Spanish territory, and then you have the Virginia colonies and such that were created as far as the map goes. So just interesting to see a map from the time period. And, it's really beautiful, really, when it comes down to it. Just really interesting. So the last places we need to talk about as far as colonization goes in the New World is New Netherland and New Sweden. And right here I have a map for you to kind of see where this is, happening. If you remember, the Dutch are ultimately going to be the ones settling up along the Hudson River based off of Henry Hudson and his exploration, up there. Ultimately, the Swedes are going to kind of settle down here at the southern end of the Delaware River. They're going to set up a fort at modern-day Wilmington, Delaware. And, this is the way it's going to be until about 1655, and I'm going to explain what's New Sweden, basically Sweden was another one of the larger powers in Europe, and this is going to be kind of the territorial height of the Swedish Empire here. And around 1638, actually not around, in 1638, you're going to have a man named Peter Minuit. I'm probably saying that incorrectly, but basically he is going to, through these Native Americans, basically settle the land acquisition and take charge of some of this land, and ultimately help to build a fort at present-day Wilmington. After this, you're going to get an influx of Swedish people, of Germans, of Dutch, of Finnish people actually all working for one of these, again, joint stock companies. And they're going to move into the southern Delaware River area for really hoping to create an agricultural colony and possibly even fur trading colony as well to kind of help bring these things, back to Sweden, and I guess harvest the fruits of colonization. Ultimately, this territory is going to be captured by the Dutch in 1655, I believe, once a war between Sweden and the Netherlands breaks out This is another great map here, and this shows the territorial extents, of these different European powers in the New World. So, we had talked about Virginia territory down here. Ultimately, the Pilgrim, the Plymouth colony, and then Massachusetts Bay colony as well. You're going to get Rhode Island and then Connecticut. So we just talked about New Sweden, and ultimately now we still need to talk about New Netherlands. So New Netherlands, got its claim, the Netherlands got its claim in 1609 when Henry Hudson, worked its way up the Hudson River and basically explored around this New York metropolitan area of today. In 1614, the Dutch West India Trading Company, who had financed Henry Hudson's trip up the Hudson in his expedition to the New World here, they're going to kind of start bringing in more people, and they're going to actually create a fort named Fort Orange up at modern-day Albany, up the Hudson River a ways, and you're going to start to kind of settle in these lands, mostly for, again, profits, mostly from the fur trade and whatever else they can kind of manage to profit from. So with these interests now in the New World, the Dutch are kind of looking to safeguard those interests, and in hopes of that, they're actually hoping to purchase New Amsterdam, basically, and New Amsterdam is essentially Manhattan Island of today. In 1626, you have this, again, Peter Minuit, actually before he moved down to New Sweden to kind of settle down there. He is able to supposedly negotiate a purchase of the Manhattan Island from the Lenape Indians. And this is for the equivalent, anyway, of 60 Dutch guilders today. And this is a relatively, pretty small price, and there's a lot of different reasons for this small price that's supposed anyway. For starters, it's not as small as people usually say. People, oh, they traded $24 worth of trade goods, and beads and things like that. It's not quite that simple. The deed has been lost, so we're not really sure exactly what went down here. But later in the writings, it comes down to 60 Dutch guilders. So when you actually do the math and the inflation changes and equivalents and things like that, conversion, you actually get roughly about $1,000 today. That's still obviously a very small amount of money for how large Manhattan is, but this is a big myth, and people have been saying this for a long time, and it's just definitely not true. And there's actually an interesting story that goes along with this, in that part of the reason why they think that this happened is that the group of Native Americans that Minuit actually dealt with, these Lenape, were not actually the ones that would have probably laid claim to this if there was such thing in the Native American culture here. So they were just kind of passing by, and they kind of almost scammed the Dutch, if you will, here, and took their trade goods and said, sure, yeah, whatever, you can have it, great, okay, and then kind of went on their merry way. There's also all sorts of different things. The Native Americans didn't really have property rights the way the English did, and they didn't necessarily understand what they were getting themselves into. So there's just a couple interesting stories around this, just to really dispel this myth that New York was bought for $24 and beads and things like that. So ultimately, the Dutch in this territory, are becoming friends more with Native Americans. They have that more of the friendship approach with the natives than the Spanish, who are kind of in there doing their own thing, conquering. Basically, the Dutch here, they befriend the Iroquois Confederacy, and you're going to kind of get a little bit of a rivalry between the Dutch and the French and the Huron. Basically, the Dutch really would ultimately recognize the sovereignty of the natives for the most part, and they didn't really they didn't agree with just coming in and taking it. That's why you have this exchange, to buy this land, or attempted exchange anyway, to buy this land, and they respected them, which is more than you're going to get from many of the other European groups. So a man named Peter Stuyvesant becomes the governor of the New Netherlands and New Amsterdam, and in 1647, he changes the name to New Amsterdam and creates this, this city at the edge of the Manhattan Island in the southern end, which is, I guess, downtown Manhattan now. So you had, during his leadership, he's the one that actually goes down into New Sweden and is able to kind of conquer it with some men, ultimately, during this war that these two groups have been having. But this is kind of short-lived also, because ultimately the English come in and they want this territory. So you have King Charles at the time in England, and he basically says to his brother, this land is all yours. I guess you just need to kind of grab it and take it. So sure enough, his brother James, who is going to actually become the king not that long later, he basically comes in, and he's the Duke of York, and he comes in and with this men and ships, basically he comes into the harbor, and he basically comes in demanding a surrender of the fort in 1664. And Peter Stuyvesant at the time, they didn't really have any way to counter it, so it ends up just kind of being signed over to the English here, and all of a sudden you're going to basically give up all of this New Netherland territory to the English, and just like that, these two countries are not going to have their claim anymore in the New World, and that kind of does the final connection now between Virginia heading up toward Massachusetts. You don't have complete settlement, obviously, along the coast there, but now there's, England is in control of this whole territory, heading toward, more toward that map that we had looked at in the very beginning. So that is it for our early colonization here in the New World. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time when we're talking about the British colonies.